There are a number of kind of methods that practitioners and academics and others try to use. But some of you might have heard of things like horizon scanning, which is kind of almost really what it says on the tin. It's just a question of how do you kind of scan what's coming down the horizon? So what are the all the relevant data points so you can understand kind of so you look at all the different data and you kind of get a sense of what's the real patterns there. So that's just one thing. There's lots of other different methodologies that people use. Um, and so with planetary phase shift as a framework, and the reason um, I went ahead with trying to get this in a foresight kind of a journal is essentially because I wanted to a lot of the over the last kind of say 2 decades or so, I've been working in the kind of systems theory space, doing investigative journalism. Um, and I think one of the things that became really clear to me is that there isn't enough conversations going on between people who are situated in these different ways of looking at things. You've got some experts looking at climate change, you've got some experts looking at the economy, you've got other experts looking at food, and we don't have enough frameworks to look at these things holistically and even to kind of have conversations across those kind of siloed boundaries. And that's not just it's not just a bad thing necessarily. I mean, to some extent, that approach to our science has given us a lot of knowledge and insight. But at the same time, the more that we're kind of holding up a magnifying glass to how things work inside, the less we're able to pay attention to, but wait a minute, you've got all these different people holding up magnifying glasses, but no one's just looking up and saying, well, wait a minute, how does it all work? How does it all fit? So I think that's the kind of space that I've been really interested in throughout my career. Um, and just, yeah, as a person, that's something that I've been fascinated by. I think it's critical. So that's why I've kind of moved into foresight, because foresight has to some extent is a way of attempting to do that, attempting to bring these different areas together in order to develop a lens to understand where we are. So what I'm going to present today is it's a distillation of many years of work around this issue, but I offer it to you, not as a final prescription or diagnosis, but as a set of tools to try and make sense of what's happening so that we can really make better decisions about the future collectively. Um, so without further ado, let me get started. So there's a lot of information that I'm going to throw at you, and there's tons of slides, like a ridiculous number of slides. So much so that when I sent the slides to Jack, he was like, he was questioning, how are you going to get through all of those slides? And so don't want you to worry too much. There's a lot of information, and there hopefully will be a chance for us to have a conversation about some of that. But there is really a kind of a structure to the argument that I'm presenting that I want us to hold as we're going through all of this data and information that I'm going to be kind of throwing at you. Um, so the five key ideas I want us to kind of really take away from this, and they're anchored around, I think, what a kind of a framework that many of us, I'm sure, are familiar with. This concept of panicky or the adaptive cycle that was developed by Crawford Holling some decades ago in his efforts to understand essentially how life cycles across nature work at almost every scale. So the first point I think is clear, is that the collapse of the incumbent system has begun. I think industrial civilization has entered the last stages of its life cycle, and I think this can be demonstrated very clearly with empirical data. But I think when we use the right frameworks, this realization is not a doom and gloom realization. it actually is something else. It tells us that collapse is the start of a new beginning. The other key thing I think that is critical to take away is that every foundational sector of the global economy, and I divide those up into five key sectors: energy, transport, food, information, and materials. Every one of these sectors is in the throes of transformation. This is the greatest, fastest, and most disruptive transformation in history. Now, I put this forward not to say that what that transformation that's taking place is in itself and of itself necessarily good or necessarily bad or anything. I'm just saying that is what is happening. And we need to understand it fully if we're going to be able to make good choices about that. The third point is that a new system is emerging. Now, when we say a new system, that doesn't mean it's necessarily a good system. Again, it doesn't necessarily it's a bad system, but it is a different configuration of rules, norms, and values. We are shifting from an era of centralized, scarce fossil fuels. Now, the possibility space that I want to home in on, and which I do home in on in some of the technological data, is that there is a possibility space of an age of what I would call superabundant networked electrification. Now, again, I put that forward on the basis of here is what some of the data tells us could be a possibility, again, if we make certain choices. But lots of there are lots of things to think about there, and I'm sure that's going to come up in conversation about what are the opportunities and what are the risks of this emerging possibility space. So the fourth thing that I think is clear is that societies, businesses which fail to adapt will be left behind and at worst subject to economic and political failure. To some extent, we're seeing that process unfold now. Fifthly and finally, those which do adapt could advance amazing, unprecedented opportunities for a new life cycle of superabundance, unlike anything we've seen before. Now, this idea of superabundance, which I'm going to unpack further on, I believe is actually consistent with a wide range of different worldviews. Now, I've got my own views about growth, degrowth, where we situate in that, and I think we can have a really constructive conversation about that. I think superabundance is consistent with many different scenarios, and it depends what we mean by superabundance. It doesn't necessarily mean it certainly doesn't mean a continuation of business as usual. It means something fundamentally different. I just want to make that clear from the outset that what I'm actually suggesting here ultimately is that we are at a major systemic inflection point, and everything that we understand in terms of business as usual is changing and is going to be disrupted. Much of it will collapse, and there will be an opportunity space to rebuild. And some of this process is already happening now. So that's the kind of anchoring points of view. And I'm now going to start with the next couple of slides, just some reminders around some of the systems ideas that I think are really just important to kind of carry with us as we go along. So this idea of phase transitions, it sounds kind of funky, but it's actually a pretty simple idea to understand, and it comes from kind of long-standing study across physics, chemistry, biology of how systems kind of can change. And so this little diagram here gives us a simple sense of of one of the ways that a phase transition occurs. So obviously, if we take the idea of water, for instance, you can see that there are these different states of water. There's a solid state, there's a liquid state, there's a gas state. And what's interesting about this from a systems point of view is water is essentially, the components of it are the same. It's hydrogen and oxygen combined in a certain way. But when you apply different types of environmental pressure to that set of relationships, then the configuration changes. So when water is in a liquid state, for instance, and it's swimming around, then that is one state that has been achieved after applying a certain amount of temperature from outside. But if you apply further temperature, then the relationship within the water obviously changes, and then it kind of at some point is a tipping point, and it turns into a gas. And again, the relationship we have in those parts changes. So a couple of simple ideas that I think are really important as we're going along to remember is that there's that relationship between the system where you've got a number of different parts, they're existing in a relationship. There's a set of rules and properties which kind of tell us how that system relates. And then there's the relationship with the wider environment, which is critical to what's happening within the system. And when there is a different kind of relationship between that system and the wider environment, then everything can change. The rules and properties of that system change. And then we can have a transition to a new state. So that's just a general kind of idea that I want us to keep at the back of our minds. The second, of course, is really kind of what I would say is almost the core framework that underlies the planetary phase shift idea, which is how do phase transitions work essentially in living systems? And I think the seminal work that Holling and Gunderson did many years ago, which I think again is very familiar, I'm sure, to many of you. So I'm not going to spend too long on it, but what they found was this consistent pattern that living systems move through these four stages of a life cycle. The first stage of exploitation or growth, which then leads it's kind of a big accumulation of materials and resources. There is then a kind of a stabilization of the system. It moves into this second stage of conservation, where the system becomes more, I would say, kind of refined and it's more adapted to the conditions that exist around it. And so there is a sense of, on the one hand, the system looks very strong, but it's also quite rigid. And then the system will move into a third stage of release, which is often triggered by there could be internal disturbances in the system, and often it's environmental disturbances. And the system, the rigidity of the system is what kind of leads that release stage where there is a kind of a release of all of these materials, energy, resources, and so on and so forth back into the environment as the system kind of breaks down in order to be able to really adapt to changing conditions. And that then paves the way for this final phase, this fourth phase of reorganization, where the system will reorganize, information, materials, and resources take new forms. There's a space of uncertainty and creativity, and then the life cycle begins. A new life cycle begins. And what was amazing about the work that Holling did is that he found that this pattern existed at really all scales of living systems, from cells to forests to predator-prey relationships between different species, all the way, I think, he even did apply it to global civilization. And I think that created the seeds for a whole body of scientific work that has been done since Holling to really kind of try to apply this framework to societies, civilizations, economies, which my paper and my work has attempted to draw on. And I think the reason this pattern is so ubiquitous in nature is because it's rooted actually in fundamental thermodynamics. It's related to the way energy information move through the natural world. So that I think gives us a way of understanding how many different changes are going on in the world. So that framework obviously underpinned Holling's concept of panicky, where he pointed out that, of course, that we have multiple interconnected systems across at all different scales. Everywhere we look, we see different layers of systems interconnected. And so there is this panicky where at smaller scales, you have these interconnected networks of adaptive cycles, which from them, from those relationships emerge higher level adaptive cycles and relationships. And we see this happening across, if you apply this to societies, you know, at the at the core, you may have biological systems, but then you keep kind of opening up your lens, and then you'll see that, well, there's there's families, there's societies, there's economies and civilizations and cultures, um, and then there's a whole kind of human Earth system, and all of these kind of move at different layers. You're seeing this movement of adaptive cycles at multiple different scales, and so that's the sheer complexity, of course, that we're dealing with. The other kind of really critical insight that I want to bring to this, and that we'll elaborate on as we go along, is when we're looking at life, we realize that in order to understand the adaptive cycle, we have to recognize really that there are two kind of complementary ways of looking at life, which are not separate at all, despite the way that our mind likes to separate things out, that actually are mutually constituted. And so this diagram, you don't need to kind of study it or anything. It's just there to get across the simple idea that life really comes in two kind of sides. And some people have used the analogy of hardware and software. That obviously there's the hardware, there's the material biology that you can see, but then there's there's what the DNA contains in terms of information, which gives that information structure to how it is that the biology is supposed to be working. And so, one analogy that's been put forward is the idea that life is this kind of wonderful, mysterious kind of combination of hardware and software. And really, the hardware and the software are just it's our two ways of conceptualizing. But in reality, these things are not separate. They're fundamentally mutually constituted. They're two different ways of understanding the same reality. But that's a critical thing I want us to take away, because it helps us to realize that what we're seeing at kind of a micro scale when you're looking at living systems, that has critical implications for how we understand the relationships within society, using this same kind of analogy to realize that there are these different relationships between the way in which we materially produce the things that we need and the less kind of obviously material things, such as the values, the knowledge systems, the governance and organizing systems that we use essentially to kind of regulate and govern that material infrastructure. And those, again, are at a civilizational scale mutually constituted. So we,
Nafeez, may I just ask a clarification question here?
sure.
So the phases that I understand you're initially introducing is the idea of industrial society, industrial civilization. But then when we go to the adaptive cycle, the basis of that is ecological systems. And there's lots of evidence that these ecological systems, like the climate system being one example, but as you're going to get to, I'm sure, the planetary boundaries, there's a number of other systems that are also undergoing significant transformation because of the impact that we're having. And perhaps you're going to come to this, but how does the ecological substrate, if you will, of the industrial society that you're talking about, how do those connect within this adaptive cycle framework?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So I hope what I've been able to do. So if we go back right here, right? So right now, I'm not even talking about civilization. We're just talking about how things work, right? So there's the adaptive cycle. What we're then realizing is that, we've taken this forward, we've realized that actually the adaptive cycle gives us it's not perfect. Don't want to say that it's necessarily, the be all and end all. Again, there are lots of frameworks, but I do think that it's very empirically robust way of understanding how our systems work, how living systems work. So before we even get to the idea of industrial civilization, we're still trying to understand, wait a minute, how do things work? So, now we're getting an understanding that life can be understood through these two lenses, right? The hardware, the software, the kind of the material and the informational. And that's where we then begin to translate that into society. So if we think about what is society, society is really just a larger socio-ecological system operating in relationship with the planet. Human beings are not separate from nature, just like any other species that we would study using the adaptive cycle. That's us too. But what I've essentially suggested is that the analogy then shifts on, when we're looking at the way in which that hardware and software kind of structure or kind of way of understanding how the adaptive cycle, how we move through the adaptive cycle. So I think there's two elements to it, and I think we can detect the way that human beings kind of work in a way is that human beings have got, what we would call our material systems of production. They're really just the way in which we interact with nature to produce the things that we need. So, it's the same stuff that animals do, but in a slightly more sophisticated. But we've developed a way of using tools, which we extract from nature, uh, to kind of determine how we interact with nature. So how we produce food, transport, energy, materials, information. So those are the kind of very material things that we do. So and that's the same thing that any species will do, but we do it using tools. And the other key element here is that we don't just do it using tools. The way in which we use those tools, the relationships that we have in our society, who owns those tools, how those tools are distributed, how we regulate the use of those tools, how we understand them, how we understand each other, and how we understand the world. All of that sits in some of those other kind of areas that we have in this diagram. There's governance, knowledge, political systems, belief systems. So what I think is clear when we look at the adaptive cycle and try to apply it to our human predicament is that we will be, when we're looking through our adaptive cycle process, we'll see evidence of this across these two areas. We'll see a growth stage moving through these systems of infrastructure and production, because that's the movement of energy, materials, and so on and so forth. But we also see that there will be a cultural and organizational and governance kind of process happening at the same time, which is the way in which we are regulating those and organizing those systems of material relationship that we have. And that will be happening not just at a community scale or even at a national scale, but it will be happening at a global civilizational scale. So I think what I've tried to do here, and I've spent some time on this just to give us kind of some of the conceptual tools to apply the adaptive cycle to our civilizational predicament. So what I'm now going to hopefully do is now apply this to what are the implications then for civilization. So hopefully this is a way of applying a very ecologically grounded understanding of reality, one that is rooted in what I think is it's true, it's the real world, it's what's really going on. And then looking and using that to look at what are the things happening in our industrial civilization and how do those fit? What does the adaptive cycle framework kind of help us see when we're looking at industrial civilization? So to then remind us what the adaptive cycle is, I've got it back here, the slide. So I think that when we apply it, this actually shows us that industrial civilization as a planetary scale socio-ecological system has moved through is moving through these phases, and it's moved through a growth phase, a conservation phase. It's now moving through a release phase, and there's an opportunity for a reorganization phase, which is also we're seeing that happening now. One way of that helps us to kind of conceptualize this is mapping the adaptive cycle chronologically. So if you look at this diagram here, that would say that, and I think there's a debate, you can have a legitimate debate around the timescales and the dates, but I think it looks like industrial civilization has moved through a period of growth over maybe several hundred years. It has then reached a conservation stabilization stage, which maybe was around, was this around the 1970s to the 2000s, perhaps? 1980 to 2000 was often considered the kind of golden age of neoliberal capitalism and globalization, which now is today we're having we're seeing the very concept of globalization being kind of discussed in the broadsheet newspapers and the intellectual magazines, that this is now all up for grabs. It's all changing. So I think there's a lot of evidence, I think, that we're moving into this release phase where there is a breakdown of those previously seemingly very stable, intractable structures. And that's opening up a possibility space for reorganization. And I think the key thing here is that the release phase, on the one hand, looks and feels quite scary because prevailing norms, values, governance systems are clearly breaking down. They're not working anymore. They're not making sense of the world anymore. And that feels really almost terrifying to some extent. And I think we're all experiencing a sense of acceleration, a sense of deepening uncertainty. But there's also something else which is critical about this space that's opening up, which is that it's a liminal space. And when we think through the implications of the adaptive cycle as it's happened in history across so many different ecological systems, it opens up a space of radical uncertainty where previously unthinkable possibilities now become viable and they're now on the table. And there's a level of um, transformational opportunity which did not exist in the previous stage of conservation, which now opens up. And so as we're moving through this stage, it's absolutely critical for us to be able to draw attention to the reality of this reorganizational possibility space that's emerging, to understand it, and to really focus our minds and our hearts on what that new world and system should look like and how we learn lessons from what we've already done. So that, I hope, is a framework. Now what I'm going to do is actually go through, really there's going to be two more parts to this. One is the negative side, understanding the release side of this. What's the evidence that the industrial order is moving through this part of the cycle? And I'm going to use a number of different data points, which again, I think, a lot of the stuff will be familiar to us, but I think it's bringing it together into a clear kind of story that can be helpful. And then once we've done that, we're going to look at some of the data which suggests that there is a reorganization phase that's opening up right now. And then we'll kind of try and explore what the implications of that might be. So the decline phase, Jack, you mentioned the planetary boundaries. This is very well known to many of us. We know that there is now using these kind of systems frameworks, scientists have identified that there are these it's possible to identify these clear boundaries, which kind of delineate our relationship with natural systems. Um, and the tragic reality is that we have blasted through as many as 6 to 9 planetary boundaries, and we seem to be on track to blast through several more if we continue at the current space at the current rate of change that we're going on. Now, I guess obviously the critical idea here is that when you kind of cross these boundaries, when you cross that threshold, you're really tipping over that particular system into a new state, into a new regime, which is far more difficult for human beings and other living species to operate on the planet. And that's concept of the safe operating space, which is symbolized by that kind of by the image of the green planet Earth there. That safe operating space shrinks the further we breach these planetary boundaries. So essentially, the more that we're kind of pushing these different systems through these phase transitions where they move into new regimes or new states, the rules and the properties of those systems change in such a way that it becomes a far less habitable planet. And that's obviously a very, very alarming scenario. I guess the one of the reports that has received less attention around the planetary boundaries framework was a kind of a major flagship UN report, the UN Global Assessment on Disaster Risk Reduction, came out 3 years ago. It got a lot of media attention around the rising trend of natural disasters, but strangely, I was the only journalist to point out that one of the chapters uh, looked squarely at the risk of a global collapse scenario. This was the only major flagship UN uh, kind of assessment which actually assessed a risk of global civilizational collapse and specifically highlighted it. Yet it didn't make a dent in the international media, that particular issue, which kind of gives us a sense of the challenges that we're up against in terms of the information space. And I think this particular slide speaks for itself. Essentially, they looked at various scenarios and they said that most of the three scenarios that we're kind of oscillating between, all of them have a tendency to move towards a global collapse scenario over the next decades. So we know that in terms of planetary boundaries, one of those boundaries is climate change. There are many other systems as well, ecological systems which is breaching, but climate change is one of the big ones. We all know that this is because of our dependence on fossil fuels, that there's been an exponential consumption of fossil fuel resources, which has driven an exponential growth in fossil fuel emissions. But the other concept that I think is really critical in kind of trying to measure where we are on this kind of adaptive cycle kind of chronology is energy return on investment. And again, I think some of you guys have probably heard of EROI. Often I'll do these talks and you'll be surprised at how little understood the idea is, even in kind of investment circles. People don't know have never heard of, not even heard the idea of EROI. If you haven't heard of it, no worries. This diagram looks overcomplicated, but it's really actually a very simple ratio, which attempts to measure how much energy you use to get a certain amount of energy out of any given resource. And as this diagram kind of shows that there's all these different processes that you need to use. Once you've extracted the oil, but there's all of this energy that you're using at all the different stages before you get to the final stage of use for the economy. You're extracting it, you're then processing it, you're distributing it. So what we've seen over recent years is that the amount of energy that we're using to get fossil fuel energy out of the ground and make it usable for society has been going up, and there have been diminishing returns from energy as a result. So there is less available surplus energy for all of these wider uses in society and the economy. And this has been tracked by many different scholars. I think even though there are a lot of debates around how to measure EROI, where to measure it, there's a lot of kind of technical discussions around the data. There is a consensus in the field, and that consensus says that when we're looking at global EROI of fossil fuel energy, it peaked around anywhere between the 1940s and 1960s. And it has essentially hemorrhaged since then over the last decades, and it's continuing to go down. And one of the reasons for that is that we are kind of using uh, more unconventional sources of oil, gas, and coal. So with the conventional stuff, which is a lot cheaper, a lot easier to get out of the ground, we've used up quite a bit of that. And even though there is a huge amount of unconventional oil and gas and coal in the ground, enough to fry the planet several times over, the reality is that it's far more expensive and difficult to get that stuff out. So the more that we've shifted to these kind of more difficult, dirtier forms of energy, the more energy that we're using to get it out. And that has had an impact on the economy. In the oil sector, we can see this playing out very specifically. This the study by French scientists really kind of underscored how much of a challenge this is. So you can see that the graph on the left looks at the kind of the scale at which EROI in the oil sector globally has dropped over the since 1950, and is now plateauing off over the next few years. If you look at the graph on the right, this focuses specifically on the amount of energy that we're using to get the energy out of oil. And this is really, really quite a fascinating graph because if you look at, say, the 2020 year, 2020, we were using something like 20% of the energy from oil just to get more oil out. We're now at obviously 2025. Let's look at what happens in 2030, and you're looking at an increase of about 30%. So then by 2030, we're looking at using about 30% of the energy from oil just to get more oil out. Fast forward to 2050, and you're looking at about 50%, so half the energy from oil just to get more oil out. It's a self-cannibalistic process, and it's just not sustainable. Even just disregarding the devastating climate impacts from an energy and economic point of view, this is not going to work. So I think that this has had a direct impact on the kind of long-term economic crisis that we've seen over the last decades. Even since the 19 kind of 70s, we've seen that there has been a decline in the rate of economic growth. And that's not just been confined to the United States, it's taken place across the industrial heartlands in Europe and Japan. And this is a process that kind of began to take off precisely when, after the 1960s, that previous study I showed that 1960s was around the time that global EROI of fossil fuels appeared to peak. We've seen in this same period that there's been a rise in the global debt to GDP ratio, and that has even worsened after the global financial crash. So what's essentially happening here is that as the economy is facing this challenge, international institutions and global corporations have used various ingenious means to try to keep the growth trajectory in the economy going. One of those, of course, has been outsourcing uh, labor costs to where they can find kind of cheaper sources of labor and less regulation and so on and so forth. And the other thing, of course, which we're very conscious of nowadays, is structured finance, using debt as a mechanism to create profits. So as the productivity in the real economy has begun to decline, we've seen the international financial system rely more and more on just using the ability to create money with interest and then lend it to people as a way to create more money and to keep that growth system working. So the global debt to GDP ratio has exponentially increased in the same time frame. So as you can imagine, it's not that surprising then that the cost of living crisis is something which has long-term systemic roots. This is not something that has just come out of the blue. It's not something that is solely related to the post-2008 period. It's a reality that has worsened over the last decades around that same period of time. 1960, we can see a kind of inflection point where inflation then begins going up. The costs of everything are getting higher and higher. And that, again, I believe is fundamentally, I mean, I think I don't want to say that there are no other factors to do with commodities and all the rest of it, but fundamentally there is a biophysical process here. And I think the kind of the energy context of this and the ecological context is completely ignored. But this is a fundamental reality which I think explains why we're in this crisis. So at the same time, as the system has attempted to kind of consolidate and attempted to stabilize, what that has meant is allowing inequalities to increase and essentially attempting to centralize control of wealth and resources. So we've seen how over the last decades that even in the golden age of neoliberal globalization or capitalism, whatever you want to call it, there's been a rise in wealth for the top 1%, a rise in wealth of the top 0.1%, a rise in wealth of the top 0.01%, and a decline of the kind of global middle class. And we've also seen that that rise in inequality has taken place all over the world, but it's especially marked in the centers of industrial capitalism. The other interesting systemic feature that has emerged in this period of time is that there has been a change in the way in which recessions are taking place. So one study looked at how this is taking place, and they found that recessions are they started off short and fast, and they're now becoming really large and really slow. And that's not just happening, the first graph on the left focused on the UK, and the second graph looks at a more global situation. And this is interesting because that kind of slowing down of a system has been called by some systems theorists, they've called it critical slowing down. So when a system could be moving to a phased transition, you can see a kind of critical slowing down in the way the system works. So you kind of think of it like a pendulum, which is kind of swinging. It might be swinging kind of fast and slow, fast and slow. And as it's slowing down and becoming larger and slower, there's a point where the pendulum might just kind of swing out and not come back. And then it kind of, at that point, we don't really know what might happen, but the system is going to move into a new kind of a new regime or a new state. So all of those things indicate that from a kind of technological and economic and energy point of view, that we are well into the release phase and there is a kind of breakdown that's been taking place. Now, from a cultural and social organizational point of view, we're seeing the release side in the rise of kind of extremism. So, in the same period of time, since the 1960s, we've seen that support for the center, whether it's the center left or the center right, has been declining over time. Whereas it might have been around 50% in the 1950s, it's gone down kind of worldwide to less than 40, around 35% in the early 2000s, 2010s, and it's definitely declined more since then. And at the same time, we've seen an escalating increase in support for right-wing populism. So all of this, I think, is fundamentally related. It's related to the fact that there is a sense of growing unease with the prevailing order. There is a sense that it's not working. And I think what's happened is that's given space for extremists to kind of come in and call into question the system. But rather than pointing to more progressive and viable alternatives, they're doubling down on regressive ideas. A study last year showed that one of the ways in which this is being experienced is really important for us to understand is how young people are experiencing this, and that it's talked about over the last decade there being a surge in feelings of hopelessness and societal discontent, feelings of despair and disillusionment, um, and a rising sense of political polarization, which is feeding the rise of the radical right. So all of this clearly is having fundamental feedback effects. And this is where we come to the idea of, the polycrisis that has now become a bit of a buzzword. Even the World Economic Forum talk about this polycrisis idea. Um, but I think what I think is critical to see here is that what we call the polycrisis, these multiple sets of crises, are it's really just a way of understanding that we're moving through this broader kind of life cycle of industrial civilization. And that is why there are these feedback loops between energy, food, water, geopolitical conflict, and so on and so forth. And just to get you guys going, a colleague of mine, Thomas Homer Dixon, at the Cascade Institute, produced this wonderful little diagram of the sheer complexity that we're seeing across these different systems and all the different feedback effects and feedback loops between these different systems. So we can see they're connected up so many different things from the pandemic to the war, the Russia-Ukraine war, climate change, and so on and so forth, the rise of authoritarian regimes. So we're now what might have, when you first look at that, it looks like an overwhelming kind of set of things, all kind of interconnected. But I think we now have a framework. The planetary phase shift framework gives us a way of understanding, wait a minute, why is this happening? How did it get here? Why are all these things accelerating in the way that they are? So, just to remind us, I believe that all of this shows that we are rapidly moving through the release phase, but at the same time, this is opening up an opportunity for reorganization. And this brings me to the third section of this story, where I'm going to make the case that I believe that there is a new civilization that is emerging, and there is actually a wonderful possibility space uh, that is within reach, but we need to make really critical choices at all levels in order to make it possible. So the way I'm going to do this is to focus on the material infrastructure, first of all, and then to look at some of the cultural organizational trends. One of the tools that we can use to assess um, this technological change, so technologies in terms of our use of tools to produce the things that we need in those sectors I described before, energy, information, food, materials, so on and so forth, is this tool called Wright's Law, or you might have heard of Moore's Law. They're a way of understanding technological change empirically, which is why I find them quite useful from a foresight perspective, because it helps you to understand, okay, so what are the big trends that are unfolding? Where are they going over the next decades? And what does that mean then for society and how we kind of make choices around that trend that we see? The Wright's Law is pretty cool because it's been kind of demonstrated to be very robust in mapping the kind of 60 different technologies from solar to TV and so on and so forth. So we know that it works as a tool to understand and kind of forecast technological change. One of the reasons it works is because it maps out this interesting dynamic between the kind of the economics of kind of the costs going down of a technology due to performance improvements, efficiency improvements, energy improvements, and so on and so forth. And the way in which that gives that technology a competitive edge and allows it to kind of then compete with other technologies in the marketplace. And so when that happens, you see it kind of goes, so the kind of incumbent technology kind of goes down the red thing, that red line there, it starts to kind of collapse, and the new technology kind of tends to come in. And this is quite fascinating because you can see that there's a similarity here with the dynamics of the adaptive cycle. And I think the reason there's a similarity there is because we're really looking fundamentally at the same types of thermodynamic processes just taking place at different scales. And this is why it's very critical to ground our understanding of these dynamics in the kind of ecological framework of the adaptive cycle, because it helps us to make better choices about what could be coming. So just to give us a sense of how fast these kind of changes can come, we know that these things have happened in the past very quickly. We've had the disruption of horses, for instance, by cars. There was a time when everyone was using horse-drawn carriages, for instance, and that was the mode of transport for millennia. And then we had this sudden innovations that took place. They were focused around the United States. Um, with Henry Ford created essentially was created this the newest industrial assembly line, and there was a convergence of these technologies, and they essentially made the ability to produce cars really, really cheap, and that just led to this explosion of the automobile. And if you look at what happened in New York, it was within a matter of 2 decades. There was a complete crash in the number of horses that were around and an exponential increase in the appearance of cars. Now, the critical thing about that is that no one made any decisions as such about that. This was a kind of an inflection point that just took place once that particular technology became available. Similar things happened in other sectors, like in digital photography. We saw the same thing. People talk about the Kodak moment. Kodak, the kind of analog film company that once dominated cameras, was just massively disrupted by the digital camera. And within, again, a matter of something like 15 years, Kodak virtually disappeared. And digital cameras, new companies kind of came on the scene. And we've seen this happen time and again across different information kind of technologies. And it's clearly, we're now seeing this happening in AI. So we've seen it happen in video streaming, landline phones, legacy media, and the shift from legacy to kind of new kind of digital platforms, social media, and so on and so forth. And again, I'm not putting this out there to say this is necessarily good or bad, but this is what's happening. We can use these tools to understand, okay, these are these fundamental trends that are taking place. We need to understand them. The biggest thing, of course, that's happening right now is this inflection point in AI. And whatever is going to happen over the next decades, there is no doubt whatsoever that in terms of the economics of this, these factors are going to drive the exponential growth of AI. So just to give a couple of examples of this, the costs of a ChatGPT 3 model are going to decline exponentially over the next decade or so. And that's also taking place in the way we see the cost of processing queries. Again, the costs are going to decline exponentially. That's even, we all know about the ecological costs, the dangers around this in terms of water use and energy use, but we're using these tools to focus on what this means in terms of where AI is going to go. So that means that we're going to see AI very likely go along the same sorts of exponential growth adoption rates that we've seen with these other kind of technologies, such as smartphones and elsewhere. And when we map that out, it looks like AI will kind of have a transformative impact across every different sector of society, every key critical sector over the next few decades. I think one of the biggest inflection points that is going to take place that is not really on people's radar and is very, very important for us to get ahead of is the kind of robotics, automotive, the stuff that's happening in that sector. So when we look at the data there, we've already seen that there's been exponential cost declines in robotics over the last decades, and that's only going to accelerate over the next few decades. So we project that forward from now to 2045. Again, we're looking at industrial robotics dramatically declining. Now, when I've spoken to experts in this space, invariably what they say is that this means that it looks like manual labor, whatever we're looking at, manual labor, as we understand it, looks like it's going to face a massive economic disruption from industrial robotics. So that's something that looks like we're going to have to think about all of that in the coming decades and what that means for our societies. Um, as you can see, this is another projection of the implications for labor productivity as we have kind of a shift towards in automated robotics in the next decades. Now, all of that could be that all of that we're gonna come. I'm gonna bring it all together towards the end about what the kind of different scenarios could be. But there are some other areas where I think there are really, really exciting things which are taking place. But again, we need to get to grips with understanding what these are. Energy is definitely one of those areas where I think the opportunity space is absolutely tremendous. And there are some particularly critical ideas that I want you guys to kind of take away. The first, of course, is that the same kind of dynamics of disruption that I've just described, we're seeing this taking place in renewable energy. So, in spite of all of the kind of opposition to renewables from the fossil fuel sector, in spite of all of the disinformation, in spite of the fact that governments are really not taking a lead on this and, in fact, are acting as kind of spoilers and obstructors, they've just not been able to stop the reality that there are exponential cost declines going on in solar, wind, and batteries. And that decline is driving an exponential rate of adoption in those technologies. And that has driven, on a global scale, a, 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 a massive kind of expansion of renewable energy, which has been completely unexpected by kind of conventional analysts, and to this day continues to confound conventional forecasts. One of the interesting tipping points I think that we've passed happened earlier this year. The International Energy Agency said that more investment is now moving into clean energy than fossil fuels. So $2 trillion or something is going into clean energy technologies now compared to just over 1 trillion. I think it's 1.2 trillion or something like that. So that inflection point has passed and it's only going to get kind of bigger. It's only going to get more clear. Now, this study was put out, it was done by a team at the University of Exeter's Global Systems Institute, I think 1 or 2 years ago. And what they did is they just, again, applying these tools, these forecasting methods, let's look at the economics, let's look at the relationship with adoption rates. What does that imply? If we just look at what does that imply for the next few decades? And the implication is heartening because it shows that even without climate policies, by 2050 to 60, solar and wind, for instance, are going to dominate the global electricity by 2050 to 2060. So that's great news. It means that there is a kind of direction of travel which we can point to say that there is a opportunity space that's emerging. There is a fundamental systemic change that's taking place in the energy system. But it's much more complicated than that, as we all know. And one of the complicated factors is that, first of all, and we're going to come to this, it's not fast enough. as heartening as that is, and that's great news, but it's not fast enough to get us out of the climate danger zone with the level of emissions that are in the atmosphere already, and the fact that we actually need to get carbon out of the atmosphere in order to avoid the risks of catastrophic climate change. And that's just one element of it. And there are many other elements to think about as well, which we will come to. The other good news element of this is that the dynamics of solar, wind, and batteries are quite different to the dynamics of fossil fuels. So the energy return on investment is actually improving rather than declining. When the more that we use fossil fuels, the more they decline. That's not really the case with solar, wind, and batteries. The more that we're using them, the better the technologies are getting, because they're not a they're a different type of thing. And as they get better, their EROI improves. So they're actually what we've found over the last decades is that our turbines are getting better. We're starting to use better materials, whereas before we had a problem with creating massive amounts of turbines that needed to be recycled, but were not recyclable. We now have turbines which are recyclable. In solar PV, for instance, we had panels which were lasting maybe 15 years at the beginning. We now have panels which are lasting much longer, um, far beyond even when the timescales that insurance companies are insuring them for. So they're insuring them for between about 20 to 30 years. But we're now finding they even last longer than that. They're lasting up to like 50 years and potentially even longer with kind of minimal degradation rates. So what that means is that the EROI is improving. So rather than us seeing a possibility of a kind of we're doomed to an era of forever declining EROI, there is a possibility of strategically deploying these types of new technologies in a way which allows us to continue to have uh, accessible energy uh, for, for society. There's another possibility space here which I want to really highlight, which is really critical, is about how you design these key systems, because there's good ways of designing them, and then there's bad ways of designing them. And researchers have increasingly suggested that one of the most effective ways of designing the system is actually to supersize the generation capacity. And the reason that works is because the generation capacity, such what the kind of the number of panels and the kind of the number of turbines and things like that, when you kind of the materials requirements for generation are actually quite abundant on the planet. Whereas the battery storage requirements, they're the ones that are most materially demanding. There's a lot of critical materials that are required for batteries, which are a lot more difficult to find. And what happens when you supersize the generation capacity by about 3 to 5 times demand requirements, you can actually reduce your battery storage requirements by around 90%. So that's a really, really interesting kind of development, because it means that your actual overall system costs can go down by a similar amount, by about 80%. And that has a huge implication for your materials use, because it means that your actual the input of critical materials, such as the lithium, kind of copper, all of that stuff, can actually be reduced dramatically. So it's this very counterintuitive kind of opportunity that seems to emerge, where when you design the systems appropriately, you can potentially be producing more energy than you're producing today with a smaller materials footprint. Now, a number of experts have looked at this.
Nafez, can I interrupt for a moment, please?
Yeah,
Sorry
of
to
course.
cut you, um, but given the time, and I know you have a number of other points to make, but you've made an enormous number of points already that I think
Yes.
uh, people would like to comment on and perhaps query. So with your permission, if we could sort of transition to the Q&A. And if I could start out by um, asking about, the adaptive cycle idea and the idea of phase shifts is, I think, clearly a very useful framework. What I'm having trouble with is the focus on the role of industrial civilization as opposed to the global ecosystems that support that civilization. Because it seems to me that there are a variety of challenges in terms of the polycrisis to these various systems. I mean, you mentioned the planetary boundaries. It's only one perspective. There's ecological footprint analysis that brings another whole dimension to it, as well as things like the human appropriation of net primary production, just how much of the photosynthesis we use on the planet. And one of the concerns about basically a green growth perspective that you're describing all the benefits of and the cost reductions, there's still the question of, there's no question that they have a smaller footprint. But the big question, it seems to me, is the footprint small enough to eliminate ecological overshoot? In other words, are we making things not more sustainable, but less unsustainable with this technology? And I'm guessing that a number of people would be interested in your perspective on that. And I'll let you answer that, and then we'll take, if folks in the audience would like to raise your hands, and I'll try to give you an opportunity to put your questions to Nafeez.
Thanks, Jack.
Is that okay with you? Sorry
Absolutely, no,
to
that's a
cut you.
brilliant and important question. And what I'll do, I will answer your question by quickly bringing up a couple of more slides so I can close off the talk while also answering your question.
Okay.
And so what we'll do is what you will see I've done in this talk. So then I talk through what we do is we go through some of the implications of that for society, the various use cases of those technologies, and the possibility space. I talk through some of the exponential disruptions taking place in transport, and so on and so forth. I guess one of the key things I wanted to demonstrate here is that there are different ways of deploying these technologies. There are ways which can be dangerous, and there are ways which could potentially be and it's also not just a technological issue, but just to focus on the technology by itself. So purely from a kind of engineering design standpoint, and I know that doesn't fully answer the question, and I will get to that. But just to say, look, there are interesting ways of designing these technologies. So just to give a quick example of that, with electric vehicles, for instance, if we did seek to replace every single car on the road now with electric vehicles, that would be an absolute unmitigated disaster. I think from a materials point of view, from an ecological point of view, the interest but we know there's a disruption taking place, right? So we know that there is a disruption. It's being driven by fundamental economics. It means that you know, internal combustion engines are going to be disrupted. There's going to be this inflection point where we have these electric vehicles coming in. So we need to make decisions about that. Now, one of the interesting things that I wanted to get across is this, again, this design space that can emerge where it's possible to have a situation where you have less electric vehicles on the road. By 70%, you have a kind of 70% drop in the number of vehicles on the road by having a completely different type of transport model, where it's kind of almost a blurring of public and private ownership. Just quickly throwing that out there, just to say, even when you're looking within these technologies, there are ways of, again, designing the way they work, in order to kind of think through, okay, let me design this in a way that is that is different and not just a case of business as usual, not just a case of continuing, and not just a case of let me go into kind of a green growth scenario, but something which creates a different type of system potentially. So I'm not going to go through everything, but look, so I've covered some of the disruptions taking place in food, some of the implications there, but I think we don't need to go into granular detail about that. To run back through one of the key other points that complements this and gets to the question you asked, that was the technological kind of analysis of there is this huge disruption that is taking place across all these sectors in the economy, and there is a possibility space that could emerge. And I think we need to look at what is that possibility space and what are the risks and opportunities, as I mentioned before. What are the dangers and what are the what are the great things that could happen out of that? And that's where I think we need to have a really robust discussion. The other thing that's taking place is cultural. And again, I'm going to run through these slides really quickly. At the Club of Rome, Earth for All, where I'm a commissioner, we did a couple of global surveys, which were really interesting, and they showed that there's been a massive, despite all the negative stuff that's taken place in terms of polarization, there's a rising sense of hopelessness and disillusionment amongst young people, but at the same time, there's clear majorities of people that want an economy that is focused on well-being, not just on GDP growth. They want well-being economies. They want to tax the rich. They want robust climate action happening all across, from China to Kenya. That shift has taken place. Majorities of the world population want to see action on ecocide. They want to criminalize, the destruction of the environment. They are overwhelmingly concerned about the state of nature. So there is a cultural shift going on. I think one of the most interesting things that I saw take, was Edelman did their global survey in 2020, and they said that the majority of the world's population now think capitalism is causing more harm than good. It's a huge, massive inflection point. And just to give a sense of the speed of this change, in 2010, something like, they did a survey on 15 countries. Everyone thought the economy was the highest concern, right? You now look at 2024, that's 15 years later, it's the opposite. 71% of people would choose stronger environmental protection at the cost of economic growth. There has been a huge shift. Things are changing. So the point that I wanted to make is that there is a system change happening, right? There is a reorganization stage that is opening up. But here's the danger, right? Most of this is taking place, it's just happening. It's happening by itself. Now, the kind of the case I wanted to make is that when you bring all of those technologies together and you look at all of the design optimization features, there is a technological kind of possibility space that you can see and say, oh, look, maybe we could have super abundant clean energy. We could do all of this stuff. Can we do it within planetary boundaries? Can we engineer it in such a way that it really works? All of this kind of stuff. But, and this is, I think this slide kind of gets us to the question that you've asked a little bit, which is, let me just take it back here again. Sorry. Is it really, is it all about technology? And the answer is no, right? First of all, the change that we're seeing in energy, for instance, is not fast enough. Secondly, there are different ways of doing this. So there's material system issues. There's issues around how you organize these new systems that are emerging, and there's different scenarios that emerge. So just to get to this next point, I wanted to just demonstrate to you that there are really two elements here. One is going forward, we need to think really clearly about what we do with these massive infrastructure changes that are happening. So you've got this challenge of sunsetting the old system, investing in the new system, and doing that in a way which makes those systems work. And the other question that we need to think about is how is all of this organized? Who is it organized for? What are the implications for politics? What are the implications for values? And so on and so forth. So to now take this back, I'm going to leave that slide up there, and I'll take it back to answer directly your question around what does all this mean in terms of is this just a kind of scenario of green growth and so on and so forth? So what I wanted to make clear is that in terms of whether we see this as a kind of a growth scenario or a degrowth scenario, actually, when you drill down into the data around these different technologies doesn't tell us whether they're going to necessarily lead to growth or degrowth. And that's literally a question of human choice. So there is a way, for instance, of deploying clean energy, which is really, really terrible. There's a way of deploying AI and electric vehicles, which is absolutely colossally destructive. And that there's a model, for instance, where if you look at these things through the lens of the traditional neoliberal kind of capitalist lens, where it's all about kind of accumulating profits without any sort of concern for planetary boundaries and our relationship with the Earth, then that's the scenario where you're not going to care about the circular economy. You're not going to care about materials recycling. You're not going to care about maintaining ecosystems. You're just going to care about escalating throughput and using these new technologies to do that in order to accumulate wealth and resources and continue to centralize it. So while these trends demonstrate that there's an interesting opportunity space, by themselves, they don't necessarily they don't give us the full answers. They give us a new set of tools to do things differently. So I think it's exciting that we're in a position where we can say we don't need fossil fuels, right? Like we've got to this point where maybe there was a point we were looking at this and we were saying fossil fuels are destroying everything. We need to go to a system where we don't use fossil fuels. We completely rethink everything, and there isn't an energy alternative, but that's what we're stuck with, and we need to grapple with that reality. Instead, there's kind of like there's a scenario where look, actually we have different tools, but the key thing is to understand the risks and opportunities around those tools. So what I wanted to get across is that when we're looking at solar, wind, and batteries, by themselves, they're not the answer, right? There are, can we use solar, wind, and batteries to provide um, and eliminate these other kind of really destructive energy resources? I think we can. I think we can do that. But what does that mean? These types of technologies are very different to what operated before. Um, they need to be there's a question around who owns these technologies. Do we want a system where clean energy technologies are owned and controlled by Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos? Do we want, and certainly, do we want to make sure that as we are deploying these technologies, that do we want to kind of just say to hell with everything, let's just continue on the same trajectory and deploy these technologies without any concern for their environmental conditions after everything we've seen as a species? Or do we want to say, what's the way of deploying these technologies so that they have minimal impact on the Earth forevermore? Because there are two different trajectories. There's two different scenarios. There's one scenario where it's like we want to deploy these technologies in a way which, again, centralize power and resources and centralized control. But I think the other exciting element of this is that there is something about these tools which are a little bit more distributed than what went before. So, for instance, even though there are still dynamics, because at the end of the day, these are material things, there's material resources involved. We still need to think about that. But the reality is that people can pretty much install solar panels anywhere. Like, so you go to Pakistan. Pakistan is now the largest importer of solar panels on the planet, and they're doing it because they're trying to decrease their dependence on really expensive fossil gas. So they're now, you have these small village communities which are, um, kind of bringing in solar panels. So this is happening. Now, this could be, again, this could be a good thing, or it could, there could be all these negative cascading effects if we don't start looking at how to regulate and manage these new emerging spaces in a way that's of benefit for us. Then the risks are solar panels, going, what happens when they go out of use? Whether it's 30 years or 50 years, what happens when they go out of use? And if there's no methods to kind of make sure that we are safely recycling those materials, are we going to be in a situation where people are just using these panels, destroying them, dumping them, toxifying our environments, and so on and so forth? The technology itself doesn't give us the answers to those things, and anyone who says that they do is clearly mistaken. But what our challenge is going forward is to look at these trends and to kind of explore, okay, so what's the best way of using these new tools that have emerged, whether it's AI, whether it's energy, also, or whatever it might be, and how do we do it in a way which allows us to move into a system which can actually survive and thrive within planetary boundaries? And that's where we have to think about all of these choices around, um, you know, how do we use these tools rather than continuing the self-cannibalistic exponential growth trajectory that we've seen over the last centuries? Is there a way of using these tools to actually do the opposite, to minimize our destructive footprint on the planet while ensuring that people have what they need and can lead, kind of flourishing creative lives? And I think that's a possibility space that I think actually there's a real possibility space that's emerged for us to be able to do that. I think we can do that. We can actually achieve that. But we will not be able to achieve it unless we really get to grips with understanding this really critical nexus between this massive infrastructural shift that's unfolding as I speak, as well as these cultural organizational changes that are taking place, and the reality that we need to mobilize the best of our culture, governance, and values in order to, um, kind of make really, really good decisions, both from a technical point of view and from an ethical point of view around what's coming as we're kind of scaling this kind of phase shift.
Yeah, just one comment before I open it up to others, and that is that the one perspective that seems to me missing from this general transition is an appreciation of the speed at which we are reaching ecological tipping points. The latest evidence being that we have a decade or two before we reach irreversible tipping points that may take a long time to have a full impact, but nonetheless will be pretty disastrous for industrial or any other kind of civilization. And it seems to me that unless we collectively prioritize preserving the integrity of the biosphere, none of the rest of this technological wizardry makes a big difference. Because if those irreversible tipping points come, all the possibilities and potential that you're suggesting won't have an opportunity to be realized. Um,
Yes, absolutely. And just to reinforce that point, which is why when we're looking at the implications of the adaptive cycle on a planetary scale, it's exactly that, which is why I said, it's not just an infrastructure piece. When we're looking at life is a combination of there's our material relationships and there's our organizational governance, worldview, and all the rest of it. Now, fine, there's an infrastructure. We can see using empirical data that there are the infrastructure shifts which are taking place. And here's the thing, at the same time that this infrastructure change is taking place, in one kind of the material structures of our civilization, we're also simultaneously seeing that the old paradigm infrastructure is literally destroying the planetary life support systems which allow us to survive on the planet. And the risk is that this could happen at any time. We
Yes.
actually don't know. We've got, we could already be way past the danger point, and there's actually nothing we can do. There's a slim possibility. I don't even know if it's a slim possibility, but there's a possibility that that is the case, that we've already blown through all of our kind of, because our ability to understand these complex systems is still very slight. We don't understand them. And what we do know is that the risks, when we're looking at all of these boundaries, every single system in the ecological, space is blinking red. Every planetary boundary is blinking red. On in terms of climate change alone, everything is blinking red. So we have this narrow window of opportunity, and the critical piece of this is all about, actually it's about the organizing system. It's about
Mm.
how do we orient ourselves. So if we do not, and I think this is the fundamental takeaway ultimately, is that in a way, so you've got these material trends which are unfolding, but the reality is that those what happens with those material trends, whether it's how fast we kind of move away from fossil fuels, the way in, whether or not we're able to create a new kind of relationship with the earth materially, in how we kind of produce the things that we need. Not all of that is not going to be viable without a complete transformational kind of like a total transformation of our worldview and our understanding of our relationship with each other and the earth. And that's really where it comes down to, if I draw your attention to the last block at the bottom here on the right, which refers to values. I think what we've now seen is that the organizing system associated with the industrial paradigm, this neoliberal capitalist structure, this ideology of kind of, atomistic, materially defined competing human beings, which are kind of just attempting to maximize their self-interest. This whole system of viewing the world is wrong. It's now been shown to be empirically flawed. It's leading us towards potential extinction. And now what we're seeing is that a completely different way of seeing ourselves, one which recognizes our symbiotic interconnection with each other and with the planet, and which is manifested through values like love, compassion, and justice. This is actually an objective worldview. You know, love is not just a airy fairy notion. It actually reflects patterns of behavior, which I've said, the phrase I've used, have an objective, adaptive, evolutionary function, but they are patterns of behavior which work, patterns of behavior which we need to look at. How do we apply those 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 values, those ethical frameworks, to all of these things that I've described from an infrastructure point of view? That's the challenge that we have. Now, I don't know whether, I don't know whether that's what that looks like. I don't think I don't think exponential material throughput on the planet is possible. But whether you call that future green growth or degrowth, or how you define it, what I think is absolutely clear, and I think we need to kind of reach a consensus across our movements, is that you have to ensure that whatever infrastructure, whatever technology, whatever or economics paradigm you're moving towards, it's one which is grounded in the earth. It's one which recognizes and enshrines our relationship with the earth. And we've got to do that within the decade, folks. So we've
That's
got our
right.
work cut out for us.
That's right. No, well, that's very much what this entire series has been about, and it's what my understanding that the degrowth movement is also about. That the level of material throughput that we need to reduce in order to allow the earth to regenerate its sources and sinks and produce the real abundance that allows us to thrive. And then there's the whole issue of population size that comes into that as well. There's obviously much more to say about this, but we've run over time. Unfortunately, we haven't had time for questions from participants, but I'm sure that Nafeez's presentation has given us all much to contemplate. The slides will be available on the website, along with the recording of the session. And again, I would encourage you to go to some of the sources, the material, and some of Nafeez's writing on these issues. So Nafeez, again, thank you very much for your time and energy put into this, not just this evening, but for the many years that you've been focusing on this and trying to get your head around the incredible complexity of these incredibly important issues. So
Well, I'd
thanks
just like
again.
to say
And
thank you. Well, thank you, Jack. I'd just like to say a big thank you to all of you for spending time with me. I apologize for speaking at length. And I would just like to open an invitation to you guys to please do feel free to reach out to me with any questions, criticisms, feedback, thoughts. It's more than welcome, and I'd be delighted also to rejoin you at a point in order to explore some of these issues with you in a more interactive session, if that's helpful. As I realize that
that may indeed
we've gone,
be of
yeah.
interest, especially in terms of how we actually implement, that set of values in that lower right slide on your last slide. That's another huge topic. Well, thanks again for all of you who have joined us, and thanks again, Nafeez, and we'll definitely be in touch. All good
Thank you
wishes.
very much.
Good night, all.
Bye.
Bye-bye.